everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm really excited to be speaking with Dr. Geir Jordet. Geir, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm really excited to have you on. I've been a fan and a follower of your work for a number of years, and have learned loads from your research projects and from your Twitter timeline, which is littered with some golden nuggets around the stuff we're going to talk about today: scanning and penalty kicks, the psychology of both, I suppose. But I think let's get started by having you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience. Tell us all about yourself.
All about myself, okay.
All about yourself.
Let's do it relatively short. So my name is Geir Jordet, and I have a few roles. Primarily, I'm a professor in psychology and football. I like to say I do pretty much all my research in football. Being from Norway, I tried once to publish a paper on skiing, and once I got it back from the 10th time, refused from a journal, I realized that that's not it. Maybe my countrymen like skiing. I like skiing too, but football's my passion. Okay. So my passion is football and psychology. Do research, teach, do a lot of consulting. In addition, I've always worked with athletes or with football players. Do a lot of workshops, talks, presentations, and so forth. And a few years ago, I also helped launch a software technology company that creates simulation software for football players to train visual perception, decision making, and so forth.
Well, as I said earlier, I'm so excited to have you on because your research has really influenced me and guided some of the consultation that I do with players and clubs, and I just actually want to start this with a little bit of an anecdote, Gaia, that will bring us on to talking about. We'll start by talking about scanning and your work in visual search behaviours or visual exploratory behaviours, as you might call it. I sat down with a young player, I don't know, back in about 2008, and I perhaps asked them to think about a player that they love, that they model themselves on. And this young player was a midfielder, Gaia, and he picked Cesc Fabregas. And we sat there and we watched this footage of Cesc Fabregas. And I just said, let's watch this. And I just want you to watch Fabregas. And then we'll have a conversation about Fabregas. Let's not worry so much about the ball or the game as such, but we'll have a conversation about Fabregas. And so after, I don't know, 5-6 minutes, we paused. And I said, okay, tell me about that. And he said, Fabregas is looking around more than any other player on the pitch. That's what I can see. And he certainly looks around more than me. And there was this light bulb moment, I think, for him, certainly for me, as I wasn't a footballer growing up as such. And what he was talking about was scanning. And that's so much of your work, and you're a pioneer in this area. Tell me about where this, I'm sure that story resonates with you. Tell me about where this started for you.
Yeah, well, first of all, that story totally resonates. I think actually a lot of players who have grown into becoming exceptionally good at this, they have similar moments where they either themselves just observing a player out of their own interest and curiosity, or aided by a coach, a parent. They get a similar type of aha moment where they watch one player, and that's the key to this, right? You have to watch one player, and you have to forget about the ball and only watch this one player's behaviors. That's when you realize these things. And if you can pick that up early, then I think you have a pretty good chance at building something that will last you a lifetime and really help you in your career. Now, with that said, so this started a long time ago for me. It started back in, you have to go back to 97, 98. So I was a young student and already then absorbed in the wonderful world of psychology and football, although there was less written about it at the time. That was all I cared about. And I was trying to find a way to analyze some of these psychological processes, some of these cognitive processes on the pitch, in the game. How can you how can you observe it? How can you see some of these things that I had read so many studies about from more lab-oriented perspectives? So that's when I started in '97 to to film individual players. So I took one camera, uh, had it up in winter Norway in the Norwegian preseason. It was freezing cold, and
Wow.
we had these massive, big old VHS cameras with batteries that were, bigger than I can carry almost. That froze in the winter when we had to film. So we had to warm them close to our bodies at halftime so that they would be ready again for the second half. So that's where it started. We filmed one player for the entire game, and I did that. um, I probably have hundreds of hours, to be honest, where I did that, and I was able to persuade some of my fellow students. And since then, I've probably filmed close to 200 and 250 players like that. Um, and we've analyzed this. We called it visual exploration. Theoretically, I think visual exploratory behavior is the most sound term, but now I'm gone over to just call it scanning, which is essentially players looking around, checking the shoulder is a word, being aware of their surroundings prior to receiving the ball. And yeah, since then we've done a lot of studies on that, and we might get into some of the details if you're interested.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, just digging a little bit deeper into some of that, I suppose some coaches listening in might sort of confused. I don't know if confused is the right word, but obviously you mentioned they're videoing players, um, but all the while trying to investigate or explore the psychological constructs underpinning behaviors. Did you have an inclination that the two go hand in hand in that time? Is that why you started by sort of videoing players and exploring their behaviors? Is because you thought there might be a link between psychological processes and the behaviors that players engaged in on the pitch?
Yes, I did. I mean, specifically, this started because I wanted to study attention. So
Okay.
attention or concentration. And then I found that the the literature on this at the time was really divided into two. It was one very much uh, sports psychology classics, self-report questionnaires, interviews, and so forth, where you get the descriptions and their experiences. And then on the other side, you had the lab studies, where athletes were brought into a lab, they were given different types of tasks, and they were obviously observed quite reliably and under very controlled circumstances. And there was a missing link there for me, because the attention that I knew that I was interested in was like how does this really explicitly, very precisely affect performance on the pitch in games? There must be a way to get to that. So that's how it started, that I was searching for an answer to attention on the field. And the way I look at it now is that uh, scanning, so the movements you make with your body, with your head, with your eyes, where you're actively exposing your eyes for relevant information in your surroundings. I mean, of course, that doesn't say everything about attention or visual perception. It doesn't give away all the information about the processes leading to good decisions, but it does give us one window. It does give us one kind of entry point and one place to start the conversation with a player, one place to start the coaching of a player or the scouting of a player, if you want. And that I think is valuable, and it becomes even more valuable when you can attach a metric to this. You can start to measure it. You can elaborate on it and attach different types of variables. Because now we're getting quite detailed about a behavior that definitely is linked to psychology, and in this case, visual perception decision making. And perception decision making is also definitely linked to performance, and that makes this interesting.
You mentioned earlier about young players are having aha moments around scanning. When you reflect back, late 90s, early part of millennia, you were recording behavior using this old technology now, this big video camera measuring the behavioral data of 250 odd players. Do you remember your aha moments? Do you remember time to like, oh wow, there is a relationship here between scanning and next action, essentially?
So the big player at the time, for me and for the world, I think, so big that in fact I even put a big picture of him on my master's dissertation that I wrote at the time, was Zinedine Zidane.
Yes.
So he's the one that really helped model this from the beginning. And watching him in the '98 World Cup was yeah, to some extent, I guess, an aha moment. So I was looking at these videos and I was analyzing the games from the TV footage, and he's obviously such a skilled player, but I kept looking at his head, I kept looking at his gaze, and his ability to take the ball and with his first touch just maneuver in exactly the right way away from the closest opponent to the available space. um, I felt eventually that I could connect that skill to the exact movements that he did with his head and how his gaze was operating. So really, it started with that. And then, when a few years after that, someone made a feature movie about Zidane, where they had 20 cameras or so following him in one game for Real Madrid against Villarreal. I mean, that was a God's gift, obviously, to get these type of close-up images of my big hero at the day.
I've got the film. I have the film. Um, and you said something interesting. We'll move on in a second towards the modern technology, but you said something really interesting there that perhaps one aha moment was being able to connect up Zidane's gaze with that first touch, taking the ball away from, let's say, the player who was pressing him. And so what I get from that is that this first touch away from the player pressing him isn't just a product of skill, first touch, body shape, a foot angle to take the ball away from the pressing player. It's also understanding where that player is coming from, probably the speed in which that player is pressing him, that Zidane is able to compute and then execute a highly skilled move.
Yeah, yeah. No, that definitely. This is to me a very good example of the close perception action coupling, if you want,
Yeah.
where his perception of the immediate surroundings is just immediately translated into his subsequent action, and there's a tight link with that. And when you look at that from the scanning point of view, I see or saw in Zidane that he was particularly good at the 1, 2, or 3 seconds right before he got the ball. I saw no one else that scanned as much as him. So to be very concrete, after the pass has been hit towards him, you would always see Zidane scan not just once, often twice, but sometimes even 3 and 4 times after the pass has been hit towards him. And that was whether the ball was in along the ground or whether the ball was in the air. It's sometimes harder for people to scan when the ball is in the air because it's harder, obviously, to receive the ball with proper technique and control. Which brings me to another part of this, of course, and that is that the technical ability to receive the ball is, of course, also critical. So what comes first here is another question. Can you be really good at scanning without technique? Perhaps, but you're probably going to make it hard for yourself in receiving the ball. So it helps to build technique as well, of course, as a part of this.
I suppose speaking with Professor Mark Williams on this show, and I suppose coming together, developing technique and developing the visual exploratory behaviours would possibly be optimal.
Yes, I think the optimal training for sure is doing both together. Um, Now, most people will agree with that, but in practice, it's not really done because again coaches look at and what players tend to focus on
Mm.
is still the technical part. It's
Yeah.
still that physical part. So you
Yeah.
can say that this should be integrated, but to actually do that in practice is still something that, well, people around the world fail to do, I would say.
There must have been some point that this progressed from a big, clumsy VHS video camera that froze quite easily to technology that allowed you to be a little bit more nimble, a little bit more robust. Tell me about how things progressed from there, Geir.
Yeah. So, well, in the beginning, in the era of VHS cameras, I've completed my master's degree.
Mm.
I went immediately on to do a PhD on the same topic, um, and and got quite far with that. But then what happened was I had some encounters with Norwegian coaches. And Norwegian coaches, I'm not sure if it's just Norwegian football coaches in general, can be, a tough crowd.
Okay.
If you're off to a bad start, it's definitely going to be a tough crowd, which is something I
Okay.
brought with me to this day. But the crowd that I had back then was particularly tough. I was at the National Coaching Convention, and we have that every year in Norway. It's quite a big thing. And I was on there as, I don't know how old I was, probably 20, 21, 22, something like that. I had talked my way into this, persuaded organizers that this is some really cool stuff you need to listen to. And then coaches came to this thing. So I had 100 coaches in the room, and there were some big profile coaches there. This was at this was back in the time when Norwegian football would do okay. This is back when we were in tournaments. It's been 21 years since we've been in tournaments. I hear England speak about many years since you've won a trophy. Well, we're not even in the tournament. Well,
That's a different song, Guy. That's a different
yes, I
song.
know. That pain aside, long story short, really, I presented my stuff to these coaches, and it was a disaster. They torpedoed me. They were not having it. They did not accept it. They did not buy my examples. They did not believe in my story. They did not believe in my research. It was just an utter disaster and failure from start to end. And literally, I had to be almost digged up from the floor again after this presentation by good colleagues, and, well, now good colleagues and friends. And to be honest, I really still believed in this concept, but I also realized that I needed to do this in a different way. So what I learned from them, most importantly, was that um, uh, I need people to do the talking in these types of presentations that talk better than me, and that's football players. Because what I did at the time, I relied on my verbal skills, the concepts, the data, and so forth, and I needed really good examples, and I needed examples that were respected in the room, and that would be top level players, basically. So
Yeah.
from then on, I started the search for higher level research participants, if you want, or data or examples. And that led me to the next step, which is really the answer to your question, and that is I got my hand on a pile of not VHS tapes anymore, but now we're on to the DVD era. So I got a pile of DVDs, what is this, 5-6 inches wide, with what was it, 60 games, around 60 games in the Premier League, the old Sky Sport Player Cam function
Yep. Yep.
that my good colleague and friend Jonathan Bloomfield had acquired for his biomechanics PhD work at the time. So I got that, and then suddenly I realized here we have the player cams that I've been collecting before, but now I have it at the highest level. So I brought with me a few students. At the time, I had moved to the Netherlands. I spent 3 years there right after my PhD work. And we started analyzing these tapes. And what we found was really what became the basis for the next level again, because we found some really incredible results. Of the 118 players that we had in that sample, number 1 and 2 on scanning behavior was Frank Lampard and Steven Gerrard. Those were the two most frequent scanners. And this was back in the Premier League from, I think, 2005-ish. And then we did, because we had a bigger number of players like this, we could do a little bit more sophisticated statistics. And then we found really big, close relationships between scanning behavior and performance. So big that for the longest time, I didn't dare to speak about this because it didn't make sense. It cannot be that clear of a link. But then later on, I supplemented that with similar studies. So fast forward until today, I've had now, since the beginning, we've had 25 student projects going into this. So that would be master students or PhD students that I've had with me as a part of this on different parts of the journey, where we've done a combination of getting footage from broadcasters, like this Sky Sport example, or we filmed ourselves. And the filming that we do now, it's definitely more sophisticated, but it's still based on the same premise, and that is that we have video cameras. Now we're into 4K and so forth. We have more sophisticated ways to deal with the data. We can merge them with tracking data that we have from the same games and make it automatically zoom in on single players. We don't need one camera per player anymore. We can zoom in on these high resolution cameras that we're using. But at the end of the day, it's still, as of right now, we're still manually coding these behaviors. Now, with that said, the next step is to automatically code, and that is something that I've also now worked on for a few years, and we have now prototypes of this system that works quite well. But to get it into a streamlined function where we can take a game and then a few hours after we have all the scanning data, that's not something we're doing right now, but it looks like we're going to get there in the near future.
I'm going to give you 3 data points, and if you can unpack these data points for me, that would be fantastic for the coach. Steven Gerrard, 0.61. Lampard, 0.62. Javi Hernandez, 0.83. What does that mean? What does that represent?
Yeah, so that represents, we call it scanning frequency, which is the number of scans per second. So Xavi Hernandez, like you say 0.83. That means that he has almost 1 scan per second in the time before he gets the ball, because that's how we've measured this. So typically we're measuring the last 10 seconds before they get the ball. So that means that for Xavi, he has 8.3 scans in those last 10 seconds before he gets the ball. And that's the highest registered frequency that we have. And the other two you mentioned, Gerrard and Lampard, were obviously the highest registered in that initial study that we did. And then we have a few others also that are in between. But if you're up to 0.6, you're at a very, very high frequency. Now, I want to mention before I end this that the guy you mentioned earlier, Fabregas, he is actually top 3 ever in our studies. So he's at 0.75, I believe it is, which is quite interesting.
It doesn't surprise me. Yeah, when we looked at the footage, I mean, it looked like non-stop scanning. And you had I believe you had the opportunity it was during a conference, or at some point you sat down alongside Frank Lampard and told him about that 0.62 scanning, and he was unaware of it, or he got wind of that information and he was completely unaware of it, other than to say his father barking out from the sidelines, pictures, pictures, pictures.
Yeah, now that I don't know if you have time for these stories, then,
Please.
okay, but I've actually met, but met is an exaggeration. Frank Lampard 3 times.
Okay.
And so the first time was the first time I filmed him myself. So this was, I think, back in 2009 or 2010. He's playing for Chelsea. I was watching the Chelsea game. I had my, at this point, small video camera, HD video camera, inside my jacket, sitting in the stand, not watching the game. I was watching Frank Lampard for 90 minutes in through that video camera. And then we're done with the game, and I was there with my colleagues, and we had some nice seats. So we had a pint of beer after the game at Stamford Bridge, and we took our time to get out. And then we're going to go out of the stadium. We walk down the stairs, and ahead of me, out from the right, suddenly comes Frank Lampard. So that was where they left the stadium. So I'm walking down one flight of stairs after Frank Lampard, after I filmed him for 90 minutes. And I'm thinking to myself, I need to speak to him. I need to speak to him. What do I tell him? What do I tell him? What do I ask him? But before I had the chance to do that, in my, of course, Norwegian shyness and cautiousness, I don't ask him, and suddenly he's out to the right again, and he just disappears. And I'm like, oh no, why did I not speak to him? So that was the first time. The second time is later that night. So again, we're in London for a few days. Of course, we go out and we go to this super fancy club. When I go to these places, of course, there's sometimes the challenge of getting past the bouncer at the club.
Yeah.
And that, I don't know your experiences with this, Dan, but this is where I feel sometimes I really get to use my psychology education.
All of my techniques on myself. Yes, 100%.
Yes. So at least I do appreciate the challenge of getting past the bouncer and getting a group of friends past the bouncers as well. So anyway, we were able to get into this place. And we're in this place, and this was a type of facility where you had another section inside, which was the VIP section.
Right.
And who do you think I spot inside the VIP section at this club? On the other side of the next bouncer, that's Frank Lampard. And I'm telling to my friends, okay, I missed him earlier. I need to get to him now. But there's a new bouncer, and by the look of it, this seems more difficult to get past. And again, I mobilize everything I can, and I'm able to get in. And now I'm not hesitating. I'm walking straight over to him. I ignore, and now my social sense is out the window as well, because I ignore the fact that he's standing there with a couple of girls that I think he's much more interested to talk to than me. So I go straight over to him and I tell him, listen, Frank, I filmed you today for 90 minutes. Of course, he has no idea what I'm talking about. What do you mean then? And I'm looking at your scanning, and you're so active. You're looking around yourself all the time. Why do you do that? And he said, like, any normal being would say in that particular situation, I don't know. Can't help you. I have no idea. And then I'll ask him more questions. How have you gotten so good at this? And I show him. And then he said, the most disappointing answer in my career so far, I don't know, I guess I was born with it. That's what he said. And that's what I felt like I could. Then I pulled back. So that was the second time. And the third time, a little bit more arranged. Now there's a Premier League event. I'm invited to speak on this topic. And they had also gotten Frank Lampard to come and talk about his upbringing, his development and so forth as a player. And what we did was that we showed him the footage, including the footage from that night that I filmed him, and asked him to comment on this. So what do you see? What do you do? What do you think? How have you gotten so good at this? Now he's giving an answer that is a little bit more detailed. First of all, he's saying that it's very logical that he does this, because you can see in these situations he sees that I need to get out of this tight spot, and the only way to do that is to look around and to find an opening. So it makes sense that you're looking around yourself like that. Now, with respect to how he got so good at it, it's a little bit confusing to interpret, because a part of the answer is it's something that I've always had. So I'm born with it. It's that part. But the other part is more clear. He's talking about how his father used to sit in the stands when he was very young and yell out to his son, pictures, 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 meaning take pictures of your surroundings, take pictures. And that's how it seemed to start, which is, yeah, kind of nice.
That's got to be a big part of it, hasn't it, Geir? That his father, I mean, who, for those who don't know, was a well-renowned professional player himself, and so I'm guessing would have been a heavy influence on his game, his performances, his development. Um, that line of communication, that instruction must have had a heavy influence, surely. Do you think?
Yeah, I think this is a similar moment to what we spoke about earlier, like an aha moment or
Yeah,
someone just pushing it into you
yeah.
that this is what you need to do. And yeah, so like I said earlier, like to have a coach that has kind of picked this up and that works with you on this all the time. I think something like that is crucial because if you think of it, it's counterintuitive to do this because what players are doing when they're not scanning is they're looking at the ball, which is what we're doing as coaches, which is what we're doing as fans. We're always drawn to this ball, which obviously is the center of it. But when you only look at the ball, you're missing out on what makes you do intelligent things when you get the ball, and that's what is the key.
Well, I think that's a neat little segue to allowing me to present to you my evolutionary hypothesis here, Gaia. In as much as, and it is a massive hypothesis, and it could never be proven, if you like. I just think we're, as human beings, from an evolution perspective, designed to pay attention to the most important thing in our environment. And I mean, it's called football. Okay, some people call it soccer. It's called football. It's about the ball. By and large, coaches, players are socialized into, development is about becoming acquainted with the ball, making it your best friend. For me, everything about the game points towards the ball. And as you're saying, it's this counterintuitive notion of don't look at the ball, look at the space, look at the relationships between players, space, and ball. And that doesn't just feel against everything that every message that a young player hears. It's also quite complex, and so it doesn't surprise me that a lot of players either don't pick up those aha moments, don't come across them, or are so oriented towards the ball because of its importance in the game that they don't necessarily pick up these important behaviors. So I don't know what you think of my hypothesis there, but that's my thought.
Yeah, no, I think it's very good. It makes a lot of sense that it's the game is about the ball. The ball is concrete.
Mm,
It's very physical. It's tangible. You can touch it.
mhm,
Space, not so concrete.
mhm,
Patterns, relationships, not so concrete. Teammates, opponents, concrete.
mhm.
But there are many of them, and it's very dynamic and fluid, and it's very complex as well. But the ball is so concrete, so of course we're drawn to it. The kind of the later generation of our research on this. Um, now I skipped an entire generation, but well, to be very short on that, we have found when we've done
Mm.
more of these later studies that what we suspected from an early on that there's a close relationship between scanning and performance that has been supported in our later studies. So when we control for all the complexities and the dynamic fluidity that is football, we do still find that the more these players scan, the more likely they are to do something sensible and high quality with the ball. The more likely they are to perform better.
When you say there's a relationship between scanning and performance, what performance factors are you actually looking at there? What is better performance as a consequence of scanning?
Yeah. There's several things that we can look at, and I mean we're never going to
Mm.
stop this process, I think, because there are always new things and so forth. But the one factor that we've most rigorously studied is very simple. What's the effect of scanning on your ability to complete a pass? So basically hit a teammate with a pass. So we did the biggest study we did on this was I think now 3-4 years ago. We collaborated with Arsenal Football Club, followed them in every single home game they played for a season, the 17-18 season. Had 3 cameras there. Ended up with 20 or so games after some failed due to technology reasons and so forth. And then computed in the context, the situation. We had variables for pass difficulty. We accounted for individual differences with different players and all these statistical things. And we came out with a very, very simple conclusion, which was that the more these players scanned, the higher their probability is of hitting a teammate with a pass. So that's where that started. No, not started, but where that kind of what that came to. And in addition, we looked at what they do with the ball. Do they dribble? Do they hit short passes, long passes? What type of decisions do they make? And we also find relationships to that. But it's also getting, of course, more complex when you get into these performance measures. Measuring performance it sounds so simple, but it's a very, very big feat to do that well. It's easy to do it not so well.
And your latest research from a season monitoring Premier League players has demonstrated positional nuance and contextual, or positional differences and contextual nuance to scanning. Before we move on to our next topic, if you can speak to that a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah. So not surprisingly, I mean, what we find is that there's certain positions where players scan quite more extensively than other positions. So we find, in essence, in the Premier League, that central midfielders are by far the highest scanners, followed by central defenders, and then comes wingers, fullbacks, forwards, and finally goalkeepers. Now, the goalkeepers we didn't study in that Premier League setting. It's hard to study goalkeepers because they're at the side of the pitch naturally, and given that we're not following the ball, we're looking at what happens when we don't have the ball. We actually need a separate camera for goalkeepers. So I've done separate studies of goalkeepers, and we find that they also scan when the team is in possession, but less than forwards, because forwards are the ones that scan the least. Now the numbers here are also actually quite interesting because so in that Premier League study, the central midfielders, the highest scanners, were just above 0.5. So that will be 5 scans in the last 10 seconds before they get the ball, which is somewhat lower than Lampard and Gerrard that we spoke about earlier. Now the forwards are 0.28. And I've done several studies with forwards, and we always find the same type of numbers, even lower than that. So they're between 0.2 and 0.3. And so that would be between 2 and 3 scans in the last 10 seconds before they get the ball, which is logical to a large extent because it's tighter space. They don't have to look around as much. It's more important to receive the ball right, and so forth and so forth. But what then becomes super interesting is when we see forwards internationally or at the highest level that are completely different. So when we studied Kylian Mbappé the first time, and we see here a young French forward who scores a lot of goals, but also is pretty good at finding his teammates with assists. So he doesn't score 0.2 or 0.3, he scores 0.6. And what is that about? And to me, it makes, now I've studied Mbappé extensively over these past few years, and to me, Mbappé is obviously super quick in his feet, but he's even quicker in his head. His ability to take in information, process information at a really, really small interval of time is, to me, probably one of the more important parts of his game that tends to be ignored when we look at these players.
Fascinating. And speaking to strikers, two strikers at the opposite ends of their career that you've recently tweeted about with some fantastic footage. Erling Haaland at the beginning of his career. You've got some great footage there where you've actually shown a scan count as he's sort of making his way forward. I think he sort of scans 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times in a very short space of time. And then you also, on a separate tweet, mentions Zlatan Ibrahimovic, and compared to that striker average of around about 0.3, he's 0.5 per second, and talk about the immaculate timing of his scanning and his extraordinary peripheral vision. So for you, there's definitely a relationship between the better the striker, the better the scanner, the better the scanner, the better the striker.
There is and there isn't necessarily.
Okay.
This does become complex because
Of course.
I mean, when we looked at this old Sky Sport footage, there were some strikers in there as well, and the one that was much higher than all the others was at 0.35, and that was Dennis Bergkamp.
Right.
And for those who remember him, he was a special striker, very clever, very visceral, very smart in his movements, and not, the standard goal scorer per se. He had so much more. And that's a little bit how I think about these strikers who have high scanning, that they could be more than goal scorers, but not necessarily, because they're so different as well. And you mentioned Erling Haaland. Well, Norwegian players, I know him quite well. Very high at scanning as well. So he's almost at the Mbappe level. But you see it also in his game, the way he's moving, the movements that he has to find position, to get away from the opposition, to get into the spaces, to not go in offside. There's a constant cognitive processing of what's happening. And of course, that is very much related to scoring goals. Now, other strikers can benefit more from their physique. They can have a more simple approach to finding these spaces and so forth, and still perform quite well. But with that said, I mean, I guess I fundamentally agree with your kind of question that if you're scanning more as a striker, that will benefit you if you're able to pick up the information from it as well.
So my final question on scanning, respecting the fact you're a sports psychologist and essentially an empiricist, so you're creating data, you're looking at data, you'll work via that data. When you speak to coaches, I'm guessing you're fielding questions around, well, okay, great, got it, we've got this, brilliant. Now, what now? I'm guessing you would advise coaches to build into their activities, into their sessions, opportunities to develop scanning in young players and older players, and perhaps guiding them to do this. Would I be correct there?
Yeah, so we have I have a lot of conversations with coaches around this, and yeah, and also these workshops are going a little bit better now than what they did 20 years ago. I feel like I have a little bit more ammunition up my sleeve and a little bit more experience. Now, with that said, these are obviously some tough discussions also, because I do think that although it's getting much better and much more sophisticated now, I do think that we have a lot to gain in this area. And like you say, I think a part of this path ahead is to integrate this knowledge into what you're already doing. So make sure you have a perception scanning angle to all the activities you plan as a coach, that you have a checklist of things that you also on this side that you make sure is present. And many of the coaches I've spoken with, and I've also these past years I've been a lot to England and spoken with coaches in different Premier League clubs about this, and the level of understanding now is getting quite high. I think, but that there's still very kind of simple things that that both coaches can do, but also players can do. And a drill that I often show when I have these presentations is the very simple passing receiving drill. that everyone knows, that everyone does, not really, not even as a part of a structured training session, but just you play around with a friend and you're passing and receiving the ball. Now, of course, what you do in that situation is that you pass the ball to your friend and you look at the ball. And then the friend passes the ball to you and you look at the ball as you're about to receive the ball. That's the very natural thing to do. But
Yeah.
the thing is that when you do that, you're also um, automating a way to scan, or in this case, not scan, that becomes a habit that is not necessarily good. So basically, you're looking at the ball while you're receiving the ball, but at the highest level in games, the top players, they never look at the ball while they're receiving the ball. So why would you
Okay.
have 10 or hundreds of repetitions with your friend where you're making into a habit something that is not a good habit? And the point of this is that even if you have very sophisticated exercises integrating scanning and training, if warming up for that training or going out before the game, you're going out with a friend and the ball, and you're getting 30, 40, 70, 80 repetitions of looking at the ball while you're receiving the ball, then yeah, you're working against the direction that you should be working with this. So it's not just about having the best, most optimal training. It's also about building habits in those very mundane, basic exercises that you do outside of training.
Well, that certainly sounds like something we can dig into. If I'd be grateful enough if you'd come back onto the Sports Psych Show, maybe to talk about some of that in a bit more detail. I'm mindful of your time, Geir, and I'd love to talk to you a little bit about penalties to finish off today. And we're sitting here talking a couple of days after the Euros have finished. As a proud Englishman, I'm obviously just getting over the outcome from a couple of days ago. Certainly very proud of the way they've played, and just so fascinated with the psychosocial factors that Gareth Southgate put front and centre in his work with Dr. Ian Mitchell and others. I just think it's been an example of, well, a celebration of utilizing sports psychology tools, techniques, and philosophies. So that's been fantastic to watch and fascinating to watch. But they also lost in the final on penalties, and I know this has been a big body. You have a big body of work here, and one study you've done, which was to analyse every single shootout in the World Cup, the Euros, the Champions League from 1976 to today. It's quite arduous work there, Gaia. So I'd love to talk. To finish off today, I'd love to learn a little bit about this work. So, if you'd like to take us through this, I'd be fascinated to listen to some of the details here, mate.
Yeah. How much time do we have again? It's, so no, I'll get started on it. The penalty work for me was it was a time of my life, I have to say first, where I laid the big foundation for this. And in my personal timeline, after having been shut down by those Norwegian coaches, I needed a little break from that topic. And
Okay.
penalties was actually where I went, and
Mm.
I spent then about 5 years, literally uh, eating, breathing, sleeping penalties, non-stop, 24/7, and collected first videos from, like you said, every single shootout in the big tournaments from 1976 and until, well, to that date, and now until today. Interviewed about 25 players who have taken part in this event to get their first-hand experience, did various questionnaires and tests with them and so forth. And then I've also tested this. So over the years, I've been involved in about, I would say, 15 teams. So national teams going into big tournaments, or club teams going into European tournaments where penalties could be an option, where I've basically tested some of these predictions. This resulted in 10 empirical studies, so
Mm.
scientific articles. That's all out there. Because obviously there's so much data going into this.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah, we've looked at everything from, what's the profile of the players who score, the players who miss, what are the different conditions where goals are scored, not so much goals are scored. But from psychological perspective, that's important for me to say. So I and I joke about this sometimes, and people laugh when I say it, but I'm not really that interested in the penalty kick per se, because the penalty kick per se it's a very mechanically, compared to the rest of the game, it's quite a simple task. Of
Yep.
course, it's not simple, but in
Yep.
isolation, it's simple. What I'm interested in is the pressure around it. It's the psychology of
Mm.
it. It's dealing with that massive moment, and how that affects you, and how you can control that, and how you can manipulate those conditions, how you can try to reduce some of this threat, how making the wrong decisions will increase the threat, and so forth and so forth. So the big conclusion from all this work is the pressure. This is not a surprise to anyone, but the pressure, the psychology of penalty kicks is really what makes the big difference. And then it's about how you navigate that, how do you manage that.
So, what ways have you discovered that work for players in terms of navigating that pressure?
Yeah, so it starts with this is again very, it's big and complex, because there's so much going into this. And when I
Of
have
course.
conversations with coaches about this, we
Yes.
can start by saying we're going to have a 10-minute conversation, and it always, if the time is there, turns into at least a 2-hour conversation. um, but to try to be short, it starts with taking down the pressure. So how can you take down the pressure, take down the threat?
Yeah.
And that's something that does not start when the game has ended and we now have penalties. It starts way
Yes.
before that. It starts with how you communicate around this. It starts with how you prepare it, how you train it, because it's not a question of do you train it or not. It's about how you do it. Then it's about the decisions you make about the team. Again,
Mm.
way before you get to the shootout, even way before you get to the game. Then it's about the selection, of course, how you select, how you communicate that selection. But again, it's taking down the threat as much as you can. Then it's about, which is more a classical kind of psychological aspect of this. Um, you will feel tension and anxiety and worry, and you will feel bad, basically. and
Yep.
and that is a big part of it psychologically, to work with feeling bad is okay. That's going to
Yep.
happen.
Yep.
It's not going to be a surprise that you feel when the English players are stepping up, and it's, I mean, it's one of the more, if not the most intense penalty shootout in history, in my opinion, given everything going into it. They don't feel great, and to be comfortable
Yep.
with that is a massive part of this. To
Yep.
work with yourself, to accept that that's how it is. I'm going to do a job, and that's what I'm going to focus on, and I'm going to put my mind to those elements I need to focus on to get that job done.
Yep.
And then the third part of four, I would say, is to have strategies for this, to have personal
Yep.
strategies for this, to know what to go to psychologically, to have a routine, to have a task that you can focus on, to have something that you know works for you, that will anchor your focus, your thoughts, your feelings. To go to that is a big part of it, which obviously also needs to be rehearsed and trained under different circumstances. And then the fourth part of it is how you do this as a team. So, how you navigate this event together, how you
Yep.
communicate as you do this, how you communicate before the shots, after the shots, before you go into the mid circle as a team, when you're in the mid circle as a team, and then after the event as well. So, those are the categories. And then I'm happy to go into any of these details if you want.
What I hear you say is essentially the first one was, everything to be ready. being comfortable with uncomfortable, which I just think is huge, to be able to interpret that situation optimally, having strategies, and then teamwork. I mean, just around the strategical perspective, the psychological strategies, I've always believed, and it's becoming more of a prominent message now, that that the strategies start from the center circle. Essentially, this starts with players walking up to the spot. It possibly starts before, but certainly that walk up to the penalty spot is, for me, so important. And it mirrors, I mean, my former life as a pro golfer. It almost mirrors that walk into the ball as a professional golfer, and being able to embody confidence, or embody focus, or embody a game face, or a way of being, or an attitude in that moment, to be able to turn down the volume of pressure, and, as I would call them, automatic negative thoughts, is essential. I know you've written about that yourself on your timeline, and also as a strategy, not pausing, not necessarily going when the whistle is blown, but actually taking your time, and going when you're ready to go.
Yeah. So if I just comment on that, basically,
Please.
chronologically, how it happens in a shootout when you are about to shoot. So the starting point for that player would be the mid circle, and when we've done these interview studies, one thing we found, which was surprising to me at the time, and I find it surprising to most people, is that the most stressful point for a player in a penalty shootout is not when you're standing at the ball.
Yep.
It's not the walk, but it's when they're standing in the mid circle.
Yes.
That's what they talk about.
Yep.
That standing there to wait, and essentially you can't do much because you're passive. It's like, I compare it sometimes to sitting in the waiting room at the dentist. The stuff hasn't started, but you know it's gonna start soon.
Yep.
That's when your heart rate is up. That's when your worry is there, and it is really hard for most players.
Yes.
Now, for most players, again, at the level that I've talked with here, which is the World Cup, European Championships level, most of these players say that when they start the walk, the stress is somewhat less, because then they also start to focus on the shot. And that's easier for them to focus on something that they have some control over. So they start to focus on the shot as they're walking to the ball, and the effective players are able to remain in that state throughout the walk. But this, of course, is also something that needs to be trained. So you have to train the walk as much as you train the kick. It's not just having the walk as part of the kick, is actually training to focus on what you should focus on as you're doing the walk, which is, I think, a part of this. And then what we find, which is one of the more robust findings in all these studies, is the time taking around the ball. And what we find there is essentially that players who take very quick time, either at placing the ball on the penalty mark, and you see that sometimes you see players, literally just throwing the ball away to see if it lands on the penalty mark, and then they go back to prepare their shot, or the time that you take after the referee blows his whistle to signal that you can now take a shot. Those players who take very short times in those situations, they have a higher tendency to miss. In our historical data, again, all the shootouts in the big tournaments since the 70s and up until today. Now, interestingly, the Euros was had shootouts that supported this finding in a fantastic way, until the final. Up until the final. So there were 3 shootouts, and it's very rare that the data supports these types of theories, if you want, so perfectly, but it was almost perfect. So the players who scored in those 3 shootouts, they took on average 2.5 seconds to wait after the referee blew his whistle until they started running towards the ball. and the players who missed, they took on average 0.9 seconds in the same situation. And among the players who missed were many high-profile players like Mbappe, like Busquets, Morata, who were really, really fast. Now, why are they fast? I think because it's so painful to be there.
Yes.
And you basically just want to get away from the situation.
Yes.
You want to stop it, you want to end it.
Avoidant.
Um, and the players who can have a little bit more deliberate strategy that can take a little bit more time, they're more likely to have more control over themselves. And that doesn't mean that they will never miss. And in the final, we saw several examples of players who took time who missed. But it means that they're not going to miss because they are rushing and because they're basically ignoring important parts of the situation. Now, in the final, we saw, like I said, a different pattern, and that's very interesting in itself. And if you want, we can also discuss that. But generally, taking time in this situation is a way to get control over yourself and your nerves if you spend that time doing that. If you have time in the situation and the time is essentially just an extension of that wait, then you're thinking, I have to stand here for 3 seconds because the coach told me to stand for 3 seconds, and I'm going to stand here and wait until I move forward to the ball. If that's what you're thinking, if that's what you're feeling, then having that wait is of course not going to help you, because then you're just marinating in that tension and stress, and it's not helping you in any way. So the key is to use that interval to get control, either by having a focused thought, having a routine, go through your shot in your mind, or just simply focusing on getting one or two really deep breaths that ground you a little bit, make you more in contact with what you're going to do, and then you can move from there.
I do want to talk briefly about that final, because I think it's fascinating, and look, I'm conscious that there's at the moment we're in the middle of a storm, and there's some really unpleasant things being said, and horrible opinions and stuff right now about the players that missed. That let's push that horrible, awful stuff to the side. I just want to focus on your research data as compared to who took the penalty kicks, because there's been some conversation around the younger players taking penalty kicks. However, your research data suggests that older players, over the age of 23, tend to miss more. Defenders with lower shooting skill tend to miss more. Fatigued players who have played, let's say, 120 minutes tend to miss more. It makes inherent sense, according to that data, that Gareth Southgate would choose Rashford, Saka, Sancho to take a penalty kick in those circumstances. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. No, that's the key question, I think, about from that shootout. Now, the wider context of my answer to that is that, I mean, the penalty shootout from a coach's, manager's perspective is really about managing risk under extreme pressure. And
Yeah.
how to do that is, there's a science to that, and there's an art to that.
Yes.
And what you want to do is you want to use information that you have at your disposal. You want to use data, but you want to use that in an intelligent, adaptive, clever way. And you can't just take the data and mindlessly use it. I'm not saying that happened in this case, but this is just generally how you need
Sure.
to
Sure.
use this type of information. And with that said, what our studies suggest, or what we find in our studies, which are historical studies, like I've said, we looked at all the penalties in these tournaments. And when we get into some of these data, we're also adding in the Copa America, which we don't have the videos from, but we've looked at basically the general descriptors of the players who score and the players who missed. And when we do that, we find, like you say, that younger players score slightly or somewhat more than the older players. We find that players that are substituted on score somewhat or slightly more than the players who play the whole game. Now, the sample size, even though we're still talking about hundreds of players here, the sample still isn't huge, and the effects aren't, the differences aren't big. But what I think you can conclude from those data is that there's nothing in the evidence about penalty shootouts at this level that says you should not pick a young player. And there's nothing in this evidence that says you should not pick a substituted player, a player that you substituted on. So in that, Southgate, in my opinion, is dealing fine with the data. And the last part of it also that you mentioned, the forwards versus defenders and so forth, that's actually a stronger finding in our studies, is that forwards consistently seems to score more than midfielders, who again score more than defenders. So if you look at the final English players, Osaka, being a young forward, there's nothing in our data that says you should not pick that player. Which means that if these players from other sources of information that they have at their disposal, I hear Southgate talking about he picked players based on how they do in training. And of course, you have Sancho and Rashford being experienced penalty takers and very skilled penalty takers. It makes perfect sense that those two take a penalty, as it makes perfect sense that Harry Kane takes a penalty. Those three, I think, I definitely would want them in my starting five.
Yeah.
And Saka being an offensive player, it makes perfect sense that he takes one too. So that kind of decision makes a lot of sense from a data perspective. But then it becomes a question of how do you manage the other risks involved in this, and that's when substituting Rashford and Sancho on 1 minute before the end of extra time, that adds risk, because here you then have two players who have not played a minute in that game. Basically, their friends, their teammates have taken the team to the penalty shootout. They've done their job, and now it's up to you to make sure that you all get the reward.
Yes.
That adds pressure. Whether you're young
Yes.
or whether you're old, that's going to add a lot of extra pressure. And with those two players in addition that hardly have played in the tournament as such, then you get the same type of scenario where their teammates have taken the team to the final, and now it's up to them whether their teammates get the reward of winning that final or not if they score their penalty. Again, adds more pressure. And also part of both these things is that then when you haven't played in the game and you haven't played in the tournament, then you are less confident. You're feeling less present in your own skill. You have less access to what makes you you. You're not in a positive momentum as a player. So all these things add risk. Now, I don't say now that they should not have been picked, but I'm saying that you need to, as a manager, navigate what are the ups, what are the downsides, are there red flags, and if there are red flags, you probably shouldn't play them. Now, what I think with respect to these two is that I think definitely he should have played. They definitely should be in a shootout, but it should have been planned probably ahead of time. All of this, of course, is very easy to say now after the fact,
Yes, of
but
course.
generally, this is how I would work with teams also around this. That if you have 5 players that you prefer to have in a shootout, then you think about that when you start the tournament. So you make decisions on your team based off of, if we get to a semi-final or a final and we have to have penalties, then these 5 need to be ready to take a kick. And how do I get those 5 to be ready? Well, probably you substitute them earlier in that game. You substitute them on in previous games. You start to get them ready beforehand. So that's a part of that. So in conclusion, I mean, it's based on the data, a lot of these decisions make sense. And then it's about how do we use this information? How do we basically convert that data into applicable, meaningful insight in the heat of the moment? And that's the hard part, but it's also the part that decides these games.
And the stuff you're saying there, as you quite rightly point out, it's easy to talk about this after the event. It's, we weren't in the camp, and we're speaking to the data here. And also the context here is just the incredible work done by the coaching staff and the players around the psychosocial component. And the reason, one of possibly the major reason why England got to their first final for 55 years was because of the great work around the psychosocial stuff. And so, look, my very final question or point here, and I don't know how comfortable you will be about making a point yourself or answering this, but I felt that the routines from the England players were, at least behaviourally from the outside, fantastic. They didn't go on the whistle. They all looked like they had a routine. I think my one concern as it was unfolding was was the stutter. This for me, a stutter in a lower pressurized situation. Again, this is just an opinion. In a lower pressurized, it could still be a penalty kick in the Premier League, but I think that would be deemed a lower pressurized situation for these players. There's a lot of cognitive load when I'm running up. I'm observing the keeper, and I'm having to observe and react based on what I'm seeing from the keeper. So I'm putting more cognitive load on myself. That potentially depletes my ability to execute that skill optimally in that moment. I'm not convinced that under that degree of pressure that having a stutter is the optimal way to execute a penalty. It's an opinion, Geir. Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this goes to the different ways of taking the penalties, where looking at this particular event now, having seen, for example, the Maguire penalty, which I think many would say would be that is the perfect penalty, because it's high in the corner with power, and it seems very safe and a confident choice. And I think that was a fantastic execution of the goalkeeper independent penalty, where you don't look at the goalkeeper, you just go for a corner, and you that's your whole focus. So I think that was well done. And then when it comes to, you call it the stutter, the goalkeeper dependent strategy, where you look at them, and we saw Rashford miss with that. We saw Jorginho for the Italians miss with that. Now, typically they are extremely safe and have a very high goal percentage using that strategy. Then the question is, with this extra load, with this being, I mean, from an English perspective, I did say this on Twitter yesterday. I think it was also that this may have been the most extreme penalty shootout ever in history. This was, I mean, a final, and there are not that many in the history of finals with England, which has a complicated relationship with penalties,
Yes.
and there's a lot of drama there. And you're playing at home, and I don't know how much this has been debated in the English press, but I think that there's a lot of literature on this concept of home choke, that can happen at some very extraordinary moments, and I would not be surprised if the home field added, if Wembley added some extra expectations.
Of course.
So I mean, when Saka steps up to take that final penalty, that is a very high pressure shot in itself, where if you miss, you're gonna lose the shootout for your country. That's I'm almost surprised that he stayed on his feet throughout the whole kick, because the pressure
Absolutely.
of that particular moment is so immense.
Yeah.
And then, so your question then is, given all these conditions, should you then go for that extremely cognitively demanding, precision requiring strategy of looking at the goalkeeper? And I think it's a good question. Now, the other side of that question, of course, is when you're at that immense stage with so much pressure, should you change your strategy and go with something different that you haven't done in the competition over the last 2-3 years, because you've gone with this goalkeeper dependent strategy?
Yep.
And that is also relevant in this. And I mean, we don't know, but I understand the question, and yeah, I think you can go both ways with it.
Of course.
Yeah.
It's good. It's good. It's good, and it's not a criticism of anybody. I just think these are important conversations to have, so we can, learn from them and potentially drive optimal strategies in the future. Geir, look, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fascinating, as I thought it would be, and I can't thank you enough for the brilliant work you're doing. I love learning from it, and I know that you will have tapped the interest of the thousands of coaches and competitors and sports scientists who listen in weekly. You have a wonderful Twitter feed that's absolutely fascinating. Obviously, everything we've spoken about, especially scanning, applies to all team invasion sports, doesn't it? So I know people will want to follow your work. How can people follow you and potentially get in contact if they'd like to?
Yeah, good question. You're mentioning Twitter. I mean, I've had a Twitter account for now 10 years, but I started using it. What was it? 3 months ago. So I'm so new to this, but it's really interesting.
You're natural. You're a natural guy.
That I don't know about, but
You are. It's great. It's a great timeline.
but football is giving me interesting things to discuss.
Yes.
so so it's been fun to be on it. So yeah, I'm on Twitter. So please connect there. My what do you call it? Personal message, direct message is open, so it's possible to just send me a message there. And I'm on LinkedIn, and it's easy to get to find my contact info other places as well. So please get in touch.
And your Twitter handle is at Geir Jordet, and that's spelled GeirJordet. So fantastic.
Yeah.
Geir, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Dan. I really appreciated this.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.